Shareholder Primacy from Free Float Media, a podcast about activist investing, securities law, and all the ways the financial and legal worlds intersect and collide in real life. I'm here with Ann Lipton, a law professor at Tulane in New Orleans who teaches and researches securities and business law. She, of course, holds up the legal end of our little enterprise here.
And that's Mike Levin, an activist investor who lives and works in Chicago. He covers the financial side of our podcast.
Yes. Ann, what do you say today we delve a little bit into the idea of a one-person board committee, whatever that means and however odd it might sound to some of us?
Sure. And we can also talk about what activists look for when they think about investing in a company and then what motivates them to activism at that company.
Happy to talk about that. That should be fun too. All right. To echo a famous TV character, what's all this I hear about a one-person board committee? And you wrote a neat post about it at the business law blog that you maintain about special committees of one. And we talked about that, and we thought it'd be kind of fun to explore how this works and what it means. So to lay a little bit of groundwork for ourselves, let's talk for a minute about a special committee, what that kind of implies and means for boards.
A board is made up of some number of people. It can be any number, but in a public company, it may be kind of large, 8 or 9 or 10. And to count as official board action, the whole body has to act. But sometimes boards would prefer to act by a smaller group, a committee, to have a smaller number of people examine an issue, and the committee might then either have full authority to act for the board instead of the board, or it may just report its findings to the board for further board action.
Okay, so it's a way to kind of get business done. I mean, we're all familiar with board committees and so forth, and now special committees are on the table. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so there are two basic reasons for why a board wants to do this. One is specialization. I mean, it's hard to get things done in a large group. If you have a labor-intensive task, negotiating a merger, setting comp, all that, it's just easier to handle.
So we see comp committees in charge of executive pay. We see nominating committees in charge of nominating people. All right, good. So it's specialization, division of labor, as we economists call it.
Right, but that's actually less interesting than the second purpose. For our purposes, which is for cleansing, meaning you use a committee if the full board is conflicted. So you create a committee, and that committee is presumably untainted by the conflict to handle whatever the issue is.
All right. And we would see that. I've been on special committees for deals and so forth. I mean, when would that be? When would that, give an example of when you'd see that?
Okay, so in general, if you're a director, you're conflicted. I mean, the legal standard is you are conflicted if you either have a direct financial interest in a transaction or if you're just a little too close to someone else who has a direct financial interest in the transaction. So
you're friends or you're
married
mother, to each other.
Your brother, whatever it is. So the company is considering whether to buy a piece of land from one of its own directors. That director has a financial interest and is conflicted. And if another director is the first director's cousin, then probably that cousin is also conflicted.
Sure.
Now, if only one board member has a conflict, they might just simply recuse themselves, and then
stay outside the room. Like
exactly.
You have to leave while we talk and vote about this.
Well, I mean, recusal can mean different things at different times. But if they just stay out of it in one way or another, then you can take care of a one-person conflict. But if a lot of board members are conflicted, or especially if a majority of the board is conflicted, then we start to have a problem.
Okay, and what problems does the conflicted board kind of create, I guess?
Well, I mean, the biggest problem, first you understand that in corporate law, the only time there's a problem is if a shareholder sues. I mean, Delaware does not act spontaneously. If nobody sues, it's not a problem. But it does become a problem if a shareholder sues. And once there's a lawsuit, it matters a lot whether the board was conflicted when it decided on a course of action. So one issue is derivative litigation. This is kind of complicated, but what it comes down to is sometimes shareholders sue to vindicate some right of the corporation. The shareholders aren't claiming their own rights were invaded. They claim that the corporation's rights were invaded.
Right.
And the shareholder is suing on the corporate behalf. And when that happens, this is ultimately a lawsuit on the corporation's behalf. The board gets to decide whether this litigation is even worth pursuing, whether there's a legitimate claim here, whether the payoff is worth the expense. But only if the board is unconflicted. If a majority of the board is conflicted about this litigation, the shareholder can proceed no matter what the board thinks. But aside even from derivative litigation suing on the corporation's behalf,
Right.
suppose the shareholder is suing to vindicate their own rights. And that might happen if the shareholder was merged out and received cash or
Sure.
received stock in a different entity. That doesn't count as a corporate harm. That's a harm to the individual shareholder. I was holding stock and now I have cash and I don't want cash, or I want more cash. In that situation, if a shareholder sues, an unconflicted board will get a lot of deference from a reviewing court, and the shareholder will have difficulty pursuing that claim. But if the board was conflicted, then either one of two things, and this is something we've talked about before. If the board was conflicted, one possibility is that the course of action was approved upon full disclosure by a majority of shareholders. If that happens, it makes up for the conflicted board.
Right.
But
Just, you had a vote and it worked.
They had a vote. The shareholders approved it. Doesn't matter if the board was conflicted, as long as the shareholders had full information.
Right. So the vote cleansed the decision.
The vote instead of the cleansing mechanism here is the shareholder vote.
Right.
But if there's no shareholder vote, then if a shareholder sues, a reviewing court will very carefully examine this challenged transaction to determine if it was entirely fair to the shareholders.
Right, that's that standard. Right,
risky. That's time consuming. It's a long process. There's discovery. There's a trial, and it can sometimes
There's appeals.
There's appeals, and it can sometimes result in a very significant damage award.
All right. Now, how does then, given these conflicts in ways that shareholders, in some instances like me, who would be on the plaintiff end of a derivative suit, resolve it? Then let's talk about special committees and how they fit in, and then talk about controlling shareholders.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how the special committees kind of address the problem you just laid out.
Okay, so special committee, it's fairly straightforward. Imagine you're a board. You know that this is the legal landscape. If you're conflicted and a shareholder sues, you either need a shareholder vote or you're going to have this onerous entire fairness review. So you know this. If you're majority conflicted, if you know you're conflicted, you may just decide to seek shareholder approval. But that has to be, as I said, on full disclosure. And sometimes litigation reveals, whoops, there wasn't full disclosure. And you may not be entirely clear what counts as full disclosure in advance. There's a little bit of risk there that somebody could dig up some fact that you maybe accidentally forgot to include in the process.
Accidentally.
It happens.
I know.
So instead, the easiest thing for the board to do is create a special committee and have the special committee decide on a course of action. And ideally, of course, that special committee will be made up of unconflicted directors. But, as you said, the rules that we've talked about this before are a little different for controlling shareholders. When a controlling shareholder engages in a transaction with its controlled company, that will often be a conflicted transaction because the controller is representing itself on one side of the deal and kind of controlling the company as the counterparty on the other side of the deal, like if the controlling shareholder buys out the minority. So if one of the minority shareholders brings a direct claim to challenge that transaction, it's going to get this onerous entire fairness review by a court unless the controlling shareholder both gets shareholder approval and negotiates the deal with an unconflicted special committee.
That's where the special committee comes in.
That's where it comes in for controlling shareholders. So even a board without a controlling shareholder might be conflicted and want to have a special committee, but it's almost necessary for a controlling shareholder conflicted transaction if they want to avoid entire fairness review.
Right. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
The issue, and it's not, just as you may not be 100% confident that you've disclosed all the information you need to disclose for a court looking at this after the fact, it's not always obvious in advance who's going to be viewed as conflicted by a reviewing court. And the main reason for that is it's not always clear as who counts as too close to someone with a financial interest. So remember, you're conflicted if you have a financial interest or if you're close to someone else who has financial interest. Blood relatives,
like their sister, wife,
your sister, your brother, your mother, all that's a problem. But what if it's not a blood relative? What if it's just someone you've done business deals with before? Or how extensive do those deals need to be? What if you see each other socially? Are a few parties okay? What if you're next door neighbors? What if you've gone on vacation together?
Right.
It's not obvious what counts as too close, especially in recent years. So in the very recent years, Delaware courts have become much more suspicious of these kinds of ongoing social and business relationships and have been increasingly willing to call them out as compromising a board member's independence. So here's the problem. You're a board. You know there's a conflict. You set up a committee of unconflicted board members. You may not be entirely sure that a court will agree that these board members were unconflicted.
I mean, if
later.
you've been on the same board for many years, you've all kind of hung out at board meetings and maybe socialized a little bit.
Right, and all being on the same, because of course all boards socialize. You all travel in the same circle. So how much is too much? Now, on the one hand, we might say maybe the board should have thought of that before stacking itself with people who can't be objective. But like you could say, well, board, that's your problem. You should have more independent people. But on the other hand, the universe of people who are qualified to serve as public company boards, it's not unlimited. They tend to travel in similar circles. Of course, they're going to have relationships.
Well, or at least they recruit. They fish in the same pond. We can argue about how to make the pond bigger, but today,
you can argue about how to make the pond bigger, but there are real strengths also to. I mean, there are definitely drawbacks, but there are also strengths because people who have done deals together before, have business relationships before, may have very good working relationships, and that may contribute to a stronger board.
You trust each other.
Exactly. But they're not great at necessarily policing conflict transactions. The thing is that a board does more than police conflict transactions. They do other things. So what do you select for? So sometimes when there's this uncertainty about who's independent, a board will go out and actually hire a whole new director to serve just on a committee. Like, this is your job.
Right,
We've hired you to be on a cleansing committee. But other times they'll put together a committee that just seems unconflicted. So that's what they'll do.
Right. Okay. So this takes us to the specific situation of, which we'll get to in a second, of a one person committee,
right,
which we talked about in the but there's nothing inherently like illegal or wrong with a one person committee, is there?
No.
Right, okay.
So this is like, you have to understand like the chain of thought that goes into this. So let's say you've put together your committee. You've done the best you can in terms of finding independent people. Now a shareholder sues. It turns out that the court concludes one person on that committee was conflicted, but a majority were unbiased. Sure. The suggestion from Delaware up until now has been that the special committee's work will stand and it will still cleanse the board as a whole as long as a majority of the committee was unconflicted.
Was independent and unconflicted.
Exactly.
However we define that and how are the facts.
Exactly. I mean, there might be exceptions. Like if the one conflicted person was also the chair and steering, that's not good.
Sure.
But if there were just one conflicted person and the rest of the board, committee was okay, then the committee may be okay. So, but then what brings us to the issue of single member committee. So you're the board. You're constructing your committee. You need to use unconflicted people, but some of them are conflicted. So how many do you put on your committee? In Delaware, there's no rule. You can have as many or as few as you like, although other states differ on this. For example, California, you have to have at least 2. But in Delaware, you can have any number of people on the committee. But Delaware courts have always expressed the view that putting one person on a committee is suboptimal. Why? Because the special committee is supposed to be this bulwark against the conflicts of the larger board. And the sense, and I think this is just human nature, it's hard for a single person to stand against the other board members and resist something the board members want to do. Board members are collegial. They travel in the same circles, and it's hard for one member to block a transaction that the others favor, or worse, recommend shareholder litigation against the others. So a special committee that has 2 or 3 people has a kind of strength in numbers ability to resist that structural
compared to a one
pressure.
person.
Compared to one person.
Where you're this one, and if there's an analogy here, when you're like when an activist is looking at joining a board, and you're a single member, you're the only person on a board of 2, 4, 6, 8, or 10 or whatever number, it becomes a lot harder. When you got a friend on the board, it helps. So when you got a friend on the special committee,
it's just easier to stand firm. So Delaware has actually said, if your special committee is just one person, that person must be, and this is the quote, like Caesar's wife above reproach.
Oh, come on. They put that in there.
Everybody puts that in there because that's how Delaware writes its decisions, which makes them fun, to teach. The suggestion is something like a single member committee gets special scrutiny, but we're not sure how much more special scrutiny they get. We don't know how much boards are penalized for this. Just recently, there were 2 different cases where single-member committees examined derivative litigation. Whether a shareholder should be permitted to pursue a claim on the corporation's behalf. And both of these single-member special committees at 2 different companies concluded, to the utter shock of absolutely no one, that of course there was no value to pursuing litigation against the board.
Yeah,
of course. And in both cases, Delaware courts said that was totally fine. and deferred to this one-person special committee. Okay.
All right. So,
So
and the special committee that got us going on this was the one at our favorite corporate
Yeah, but-
governance
but
poster
honestly,
child
it's
was
a bigger issue.
Tesla. Right. I
Yeah,
understand. But what happened? What was the one at Tesla? So there was a
Well,
special
well,
committee.
Well, no, actually, no. I'm sorry. There is like you've got to understand what happened in Match
Thank you.
Group.
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
Match Group. Right.
Because
yes.
there's this new development there. So all this cashes out in Match. This was this decision by the Delaware Supreme Court, which involved a corporate restructuring that conferred special benefits on a corporate controlling shareholder. The controlling shareholder went through the whole process of negotiating the deal with a 3-member committee, and they got public shareholder approval. But later, when a shareholder sued, the court found after the fact that one member of the committee was conflicted because he previously worked for the controlling shareholder and had served as director at its affiliated company.
That's a conflict, I would think.
Yeah, so he wasn't employed by the controller when this transaction was negotiated, but the court believed these past ties were enough to cloud his judgment. And the Delaware Supreme Court now held for the first time that when we're talking at least about controlling shareholder deals, the kind of deal that needs both independent committee approval and shareholder approval to avoid fairness review, that they had in those deals the presence of even one tainted director is enough to taint the entire committee
so
process.
it's not majority of the committee anymore. The whole committee needs
any
to be,
one of them will kill it. So it's not clear that this would extend to other situations with a special committee. It may only be for controlling shareholder transactions. It's not entirely clear, but it definitely now applies to controlling shareholder deals. So on the one hand, that makes perfect sense. If the idea is these committee members shore each other up, then having one cuckoo in the nest is going to ruin that effect, right?
Okay.
But on the other hand, if you're a board and you are not 100% sure who counts as independent, the logical thing to do is just put only one person on the committee. Like,
Sure.
I know this one person is independent.
I know
Why
exactly
risk adding
this
somebody
person.
else?
Right, okay.
And now,
Delaware allows it. And Delaware says you can
allows
have a one-person committee.
And right, so if Delaware courts mouth all this language about being suspicious of one-person committees, but if they don't actually follow through and actually like say, well, it was only one person, I don't trust it, then you've created this incentive to create a one-person committee, even though we've just said it's better if there are at least 2 people.
Got it.
And that's
okay, so
when
that
we
was
get to
that
the
was
Tesla
Match.
question.
And
Yeah.
then that brought us to Tesla's one-person committee wasn't really wasn't part of the litigation sort of
Not
was,
exactly.
but not really. Yeah.
So this kind of splatters over our favorite corporate governance
I
hot
know
mess.
this year. Yeah,
Tesla.
hot mess. Yes, right.
So, as everyone on the planet knows, Tesla held a shareholder vote to ratify Elon Musk's pay after it was rescinded and also to move the company to Texas. And those proposals were originally examined and recommended by a single-member special committee. The committee was supposed to be 2 directors.
Yes.
And because they were only going to examine the move to Texas, but then the committee decided.
Let me stop right there. So the original charter of the special committee. So they say, special committee, you people need to research whether we should move to Texas.
Exactly.
Right. And everybody knows that's a fait accompli anyway.
And,
Elon tweeted
they
he
are
wanted to do that.
swearing up and down that they had no idea what this committee was going to do.
Oh, we didn't know where this is going, but okay. So there was a two-person special committee.
The fact that the CEO of the company, who's identified with the company, tweeted, "We're going to Texas." That had no influence at all.
And then they added to the charter. They said you got 2 things you got to work on, and the second was evaluating
whether to ratify his pay, whether to restore it.
Right.
And
so
at
the
point,
two votes that were taken.
Right, exactly. And at that point, one of the committee members decided that at least for appearance's sake, he would look too dependent on Musk and he should drop out. And so the whole thing actually went forward with just one person, a director named Kathleen Wilson Thompson is the only person on this committee to determine whether to recommend both things, a move to Texas and a vote to ratify Musk's pay. And as we all know, the shareholders voted in favor of both. Tesla's now...
Well, and they recommended, her special committee of 1
recommended both of these things. Exactly. Now, it's not clear that the new shareholder vote ratified anything. We talked about that in a prior show. Yeah. Chancellor McCormick has to decide that issue. But one of the things she's going to have to consider when she considers whether the new vote ratified anything was how much do we trust a single member special committee? Especially since this one committee member, who may have no personal ties to Musk, but she did earn $135 million in Tesla stock as a director. So McCormick may have questions.
And it was like a big part of her wealth, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so McCormick, even if it was a small part of her wealth, I think $135 million makes a difference.
It's still a lot. Yeah, okay. Right.
So McCormick may have questions about whether this committee can really be trusted, and all that may fold back into her decision as to whether the new vote was enough to ratify Musk's pay package.
So the problem, to take us to the end, not the end, but is not that Tesla had a one-person committee. It's who the one person was, what she did, and how conflicted she was or was not in making these decisions.
Well, but it's all part of it. Again, even if she was like Caesar's wife, you have this problem. You still have the structural problem of a one-person committee maybe doesn't have the strength, no matter, even if they aren't making 135. It's hard to do. It's a hard thing to do to stand up against a full board and a powerful company defining CEO. So that's a problem with a one-person special committee in general, which is exactly why it's sort of weird that Match was the Delaware Supreme Court put boards in this weird position where it's almost better to have a one-person special committee, because at least then they can be sure that they won't have any conflicted members infecting the committee process.
Wow. So even though we set out to talk and possibly joke slightly about a one-person committee, this discussion really pertains to what kind of committee.
Yeah.
And whether that one person, particularly at Tesla, but at Match and all sorts of other places, what kind of conflicts and what kind of process they go through and so forth.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
That's very instructive. Huh. Well, how about, should we take a little break? Let's take a little break. And we can return to talk in a little bit about how activists think about their efforts here at Shareholder Primacy.
This is the Free Flow Media Podcast Network, where we cover the who of the business news, because investing isn't a what, it's a who. Check out our other podcast, Business Pants, for fact-based snark covering companies and executives, and the Proxy Countdown, the only podcast that treats company meetings like sporting events. Find them on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Back to the show.
Welcome back to Shareholder Primacy. I'm Ann Lipton here with Mike Levin. So, Mike, I wanted to ask you, because I'm just an academic and I deal with, sort of theoretical and less practical, and I wanted to ask you about the thought process of activist investors. So we both were at this panel at a conference a few weeks ago where this question came up several times, and the audience was company people, and they wanted to know from a real live, in the flesh activist investor, that's you, how it works. And I thought that was really interesting. So what is it that activists look for in deciding whether even to invest in one company or another company?
So that was a fun conference. That was good in Nashville. That was great. There were a lot of questions from company people like, "What do you do?" And so the decision to invest, we have to do this in kind of parts and pieces. But the decision to whether to even take a position, you would recognize as one of value or deep value investing. Okay, all the analytics, all the research revolves around what kind of value prop. This isn't growth. This isn't a trading strategy. This is all straight value investing, meaning that based on whatever metrics, whatever analysis we do, that the underlying assets and cash flows are not priced in properly in the share price. So look, there's gajillions of people that do value investing. So that's the first part of it. And companies, it won't surprise most companies that find themselves in an activist situation that their share price is undervalued. A lot of probably CEOs walk around saying that to themselves anyway.
Yeah, I imagine most CEOs think their share price is undervalued, except for Elon Musk, who occasionally tweets Tesla's overvalued.
Yes, he's a special case. But then there's a second dimension to this, okay? And it's very, very loosely grouped under the heading of corporate governance, okay? We're looking at what things related to the stewardship or the board or around how the company is kind of run that we think should change, or that are obstacles to achieving some of the value in that we think is possible.
Okay,
So there's those kind of two dimensions. It's the value proposition, then also the kind of the corporate governance.
okay, so what is it about corporate governance that catches your attention as an obstacle to the company?
Okay, so that yes, it tends. Sometimes it's really kind of mundane. It's kind of how votes work, or look at the bylaws. There's something there. Okay, but it tends to revolve around how the board leads, manages, supervises senior executives, the kind of decisions they make when they're in charge of things. Because there's certain decisions that go to the board, like dividend policy, or cash return and so forth. And then there's others where they're just how are they supervising management. But we know. So another way to look at the value governance dichotomy, to use a word, is that if we know there's some sort of value trade, but the only thing standing in the way of value is like secular things in the industry sector, or like macroeconomic factors or something. We're just waiting for some trend. This wouldn't be an activist situation. This should just be straight, a long only value investment. Okay, but we know there's some things that management should be doing, or the company should be doing better or differently, strategically, operationally, in terms of their balance sheet, in terms of the managed people, who knows what. Okay, and there's some governance things that are kind of getting in the way of that happening. That the incentives are off. We frequently get into executive comp discussions.
Yeah, so I was thinking, it's like executive comp is a fairly obvious where you might think the incentives are off. Is there anything else?
Yeah, it could. Let's talk a little bit about executive comp before we leave that for a sec. Frequently, the executive comp issue is not amount of pay, which always gets a lot of people's attention. That's what all the SEC disclosures are all about in terms of pay ratio and pay for performance and so forth. That's all nice. We're more interested in how the comp is structured, what kind of incentives are in place, what you're kind of bonused on. Okay. Everyone's more or less a fan of more equity, but when equity is getting handed out, for basically hitting easy goals,
right?
That's a problem. So there's an old saying, it's not how much you're paid, but how, and we look at the how pretty closely. So that's an important element of corporate governance, because the board's basically in charge of retaining and defining the how. There's other kind of corporate governance aspects. We're going to look at some stuff we talked about a little earlier. About conflicts on the board. We're going to look at their kind of expertise. We're going to look at, importantly, kind of how, not just independent like on paper from SEC definitions of independence, but in a practical way. Do they push back on decisions in the right way? Are they overly defensive of a CEO when he doesn't deserve it?
Now, are you getting this all from SEC filings or from other sources?
All sorts of places.
Or chatter, or
well, I'll talk to former employees. I'll talk to competitors. I'll talk to securities analysts. I'll read a lot of stuff.
Right.
I have not ever gotten to the place where I've hired private PIs on this kind of stuff.
No,
there are other activists
that
do that.
I'm not trying to bait you into a confession of insider trading either. But,
Thank you. No, but there's a lot of sources of information. A lot of times I talk to other shareholders.
Okay.
And sort of try to assess what they think, what they've learned, because there's some shareholders that just don't barely follow it. It's in an index, and there's others that follow it pretty closely.
Okay. So you've identified a company with a corporate governance problem that is impeding value creation.
Yes.
You invest in the company, and then what?
Then we start to try to talk. And again, there's going to be many different activists that have many different takes on this. So this is kind of one person, but I think I'm a little representative of a lot of folks that are at least just trying to make money. Because again, in the end, we're trying to convert this value investment, and we're trying to bring it up to what we think it's worth, or even more. Okay, and so we're going to want to start to, as we say, engage, and maybe start to. Maybe have a little discussion with management. I have very modest expectations for how those conversations go. management in many companies views all shareholders, but particularly folks like me with a website called the Activist Investor, as something of a nuisance and an irritant.
Right.
And I understand that. I don't agree it should be that way, but I get where they're coming from. So like I said, I have modest expectations for where that conversation is going to go. But I want to at least create a little bit of a, paper trail, a record, or whatever, that I have made a good faith effort.
That you tried the nice way.
I've made a good faith effort to try to convey some of our thoughts and so on. Okay. At the same time, the other thing I'm doing is talking to other shareholders.
Nice.
Okay. There's a lot.
You're building your stick.
There's a lot you can do, and stay within, not forming a group and, not having to disclose stuff or whatever, where we can start to talk to other shareholders. And that happens a lot, probably more than companies probably appreciate.
Okay.
Because I want to, I have a thesis for the value investment. I want to make sure that I want to pressure test it and sort of see what others think of it, and no better place to go than other shareholders. And maybe start to ask questions like, what do you think? If you talk to management, what do you think of the board? Start to really, gather some intel about what you think other shareholders might be willing to support. This is well short of forming a group. It's well short of soliciting anything. It's just conversations that are allowed
feeling
under...
out what people, feeling out what people support.
Right. And then at some point, we'll go back to management and say, look, not only do we think this ought to happen at this company, nor do we think you ought to give back a bunch of cash, but we are highly confident a lot of other shareholders agree with us. Because, we're going to own, a small percentage of the shares. And I've said this before. I said this at our conference, that, there's very, very few activist investors. I can count them on one hand, and they're named Elliott, and I count them, where just on their own, just through their investment, they can start to influence. Most of the time, most activists, even big ones that we'd recognize, and even Elliott, I know they do this too, are going to start to try to suss out and figure out who supports what. And then our hope is that management wants to continue to talk and maybe start to talk about the leadership and, put someone on a board if we think that's what needs to happen. Most of the time, or many times, too many times that needs to happen, management starts to either get really defensive or just shut down. Okay. And that's when you escalate is your term. That's kind of foolish. Because a couple things. First, an activist has thought very clearly about the steps, thought way ahead about what they want to do, what they're prepared to spend money on, what the bylaws will allow us and not allow us to do. Okay, we got a whole,
you're not even beginning to urge them without already planning for what happens when they try to shut you down.
Exactly. Okay. And the other thing that's worth knowing is that for most activists, it takes a lot of work to do an activist project, proxy contest. It's not trivial. Okay, but it's still one company in our portfolio. Possibly not that much of our assets are there. It's a couple years from now, it's if we succeed or fail, we may have still have the investment but moved on. But this is not that big a deal to us, and we don't care what people think anyway. That's kind of what it takes to do this. If you're a company, this is your career, okay? Right. And if we're prepared to, we don't like it, we don't do that willingly. We're prepared to make a company look kind of bad if they deserve it. We're not going to do this wantonly or gratuitously, but if someone doesn't even want to have a conversation, we're going to tell other shareholders, look, we've really tried to be nice about this and discreet and do this in a very inexpensive and thoughtful way, and they don't want to.
Okay, so the board is not responding to your efforts. You've shown them, other shareholders agree with you, whatever, and they're just trying to freeze you out. And at this point, that's when things get,
that's when things get hairy.
The term we all learned at the conference from you was escalate.
Escalate, yes, and we escalate. And that could go in many ways. That could be a proxy contest. It could be, because again, the board's the center of this. We know that both from a legal and also from a practical perspective. The board's kind of where the action is. And we're going to want representation. We're going to want to know what's going on, and so forth. So we may start nominating directors. There's also potentially changes in governance that will either help with our board efforts or just on their own help with influencing a company. Occasionally, we saw this and we talked about this recent show. When maybe a proposal or two would help. Increasingly, we should talk about this some more at some point. Increasingly, activists and companies they're starting to sue each other more over this stuff. So
right.
Part of the plan is looking: is there some sort of an opportunity? Is there some sort of a need to litigate some of what we're seeing? Again, we do not take that lightly. That's an enormous hassle. But that's also a possibility. Go ahead.
And you'll do, I presume, like books and records requests and
yes.
all that. Where do those come in the process?
Pretty early. Books and records.
So that's when you're trying to feel out what the issues are.
I'll do a book. I mean, put it this way: if the discussions with the company are going well, and they say, "Yeah, we're kind of interested in what you're talking about. Maybe we'll put someone on the board or something like that." And we're not going to get everything we want, but that's the art of compromise. I'm not going to do a books and records request, but if there's some real information I'm trying to find out, including like a stockholder list, or minutes of board meetings or committee proceedings and so forth that'll help me with one or another part of my thesis, I'm gonna start looking for that. Okay. And I'm gonna do that both because the information is really helpful, but second, that helps escalate. That sort of tells a company that we're kind of serious and we're not going away.
Okay, I mean, the reason I find that interesting, I just have to say, is because, I read these decisions all the time on books and records requests, and 99% of the issues in books and records requests that make it to a court so that there is a decision, it's really a shareholder who's thinking of fiduciary duty litigation. They aren't really using the tool for the purpose of what your purpose is, the actual governance purpose. So I'm guessing that those are the cases that don't make it to a court.
Oh, yeah, no. I mean, we'll litigate. I've never been involved in, at least in Delaware, books and records 220 litigation. I've submitted my share of demands and so forth.
Yeah.
But to the extent that I'm familiar with activist 220 demands outside of litigation, I mean outside of like a potential like derivative lawsuit.
Yeah.
Okay, and it gets litigated. Maybe we're trying to like figure out whether we have a proper purpose. Or what there's some nuance in the 220 thing where I'm familiar with at least a couple of cases where some activists have said, there's some information we want, and but it rare, like I said, most of the activist stuff outside of a derivative suit planning doesn't really involve.
It doesn't end up in a. No, it's just interesting because if you only look at the cases, you think no one uses this tool except.
We use 220 stuff all the time. And in various states and so forth. But again, mostly it's, the basic one's a shareholder list. No one ever litigates that. You just give it up.
Yeah. Well, there have been weird cases. But
there have been some of those. We should spend a podcast talking about that.
Okay. All right. So,
I'll write that down.
So you've got this board. They're stonewalling you, and now you've escalated. A proxy contest, maybe a lawsuit, maybe a proposal process, something like that. Anything else?
Again, the end game for us is share price appreciation.
Right.
I don't necessarily. I'm not dying to be on a board. I don't need the money. Don't need the credential. I'll do it, but we're so if there's a path forward to achieving that value, great. We'll kind of collaborate with the company to try to do it. If they continue to stonewall. It gets to a decision. Do I stay in the stock and continue to try to influence, or do I get out? And hopefully I've done my analysis early on that when I was looking at the governance that there's a chance to prevail. I'm not going to do this with a company with insiders controlling 45% of the vote, or with some sort of horrible staggered board or something that just has no a very limited path. To influence. There's way too many companies to look at in my value screen. To worry about that. So go ahead.
So So I mean, just so imagine you're the board now. Like you're the board.
Yeah.
You show up on the board's doorstep.
Yeah. And I've been on boards, so I know.
And let's say you in good faith believe that you don't need this. Either you think your share price is just fine, or you recognize there's a problem, but you also have you understand what you have your own plan.
I like my plan.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what would you advise a board dealing with you to make this go away without disrupting anything, but, like with, not encourage that things get worse?
You can't, it's hard. It's hard to make it go away. That's the thing, is that there's sort of a short term and a long term way to do this. The short term is, try to listen. Again, you can tell the activist you're just one shareholder. If you're confident that a lot of other people agree with you, maybe then the premise of your question is wrong, that maybe everything isn't okay.
Right.
But if you're really that confident and you have empirical evidence for that confidence, it would still behoove a board to treat a shrewd activist who maybe only owns a couple percent with a little bit of deference.
Right.
And say, look, you're in the minority. We're pretty sure that not everyone agrees with you, even though you think they do. Okay. But let's try to stay in touch. I mean, as I say, you can't have too many friends in this economy. Okay. The longer term path is to, do a lot, better engagement and, board outreach and so forth, and to really cultivate your shareholder base in a way that really kind of puts the activists on an island. Okay. That sort of makes them a lot less likely to be able to say, I'm confident that other people support me.
I see. So, yeah. Okay. All right. That makes
how's
sense.
That? All right.
All right. So, Mike, we will wrap up there, and there's more we'll cover next time.
Excellent. Well, Ann, it's been terrific talking about these subjects. This is Shareholder Primacy, hosted by Ann Lipton and me, Mike Levin. I'm an independent activist investor and advisor to investors about their activist situation. Ann, as we have heard, is the Michael M. Fleischman Professor in Business Law and Entrepreneurship at Tulane Law School, and also an affiliate of Tulane's Murphy Institute. You can find me, Mike, at theactivistinvestor.com and Ann at law.tulane.edu. Our podcast is produced and distributed by Free Float Media. Thanks to them, and thanks to everybody out there for listening, and we will talk again soon.